Imagine logging into your brokerage or bank account today and seeing nothing but zeros. Total wipeout. That's exactly what happened to thousands of everyday Americans back in 1837. And here's the wildest part. This wasn't some random market accident. This was a brutal, incredibly toxic, and highly personal grudge match between a sitting president and a billionaire central banker.
Seriously, picture your entire life savings, the cash in your wallet, the credit line running your small business, literally frozen overnight, completely worthless. Retail investors, everyday workers, merchants, they lost absolutely everything. Local banks literally locked their doors and flat out refused to hand over physical gold or silver for paper notes. Local trade just died on the spot. Families couldn't even buy groceries. And it all kicked off over a massive war for the very soul of American money.
So here's the setup. Right at the center of the U.S. economy, you had the second bank of the United States, run by this wealthy, ultra-calculating central banker named Nicholas Biddle. His primary strategy? Keep inflation low by forcing local state banks to actually prove they held the physical gold and silver to back up the paper money they were printing. But President Andrew Jackson? He absolutely hated this bank. He'd personally lost a fortune on sketchy paper notes years earlier and saw this central bank as an unconstitutional monopoly basically built to just make the elite richer. In 1832, Biddle tries to corner Jackson by applying for an early charter renewal. Jackson doesn't blink. He vetoes the bill and privately says, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." By nuking Biddle's central bank, Jackson accidentally ripped away the only regulatory safety brake the American economy had left.
And that leads us right into the ultimate macroeconomic wipeout. See, in the early 1830s, the U.S. macro environment was running incredibly hot on a massive wave of state-funded infrastructure projects. We're talking canals, railways, toll roads, boom times everywhere. But under the hood, this entire transportation revolution was running on pure leverage, cheap, unbacked paper currency. By 1832, the structural cracks really started showing. After Jackson gets reelected, he doubles down on his veto and orders the immediate removal of all federal deposits from the central bank. Biddle is furious, so he retaliates. He aggressively chokes off credit nationwide, calling in loans to artificially engineer a sharp recession. Why? Just to force Congress to override the president. But Biddle's massive power play backfires entirely. Public opinion turns violently against him. He's forced to back down, but the permanent damage was already done. The financial system safety net was completely shattered. Which brings us to what might be the original, massive American leverage trap.
With the central bank entirely sidelined, the government starts redirecting its federal reserves into politically connected, state-chartered institutions. People called them pet banks. The Treasury explicitly tells these local banks, go out there, expand your lending, get that cash moving. And without any central clearinghouse to keep them in check, they went absolutely wild. By 1836, a network of 634 local banks had pumped out a staggering $525 million in outstanding loans. They were literally printing paper money out of thin air, fueling a speculative frenzy the country had never seen.
But here is where the math gets absolutely terrifying. $38 million. That was the actual physical gold and silver coin they held in reserve to back up those $525 million in loans. It's the ultimate leverage trap, right? The entire system is floating on absolute air. Every single citizen is trading these paper bills that are practically illusions. The aggregate gold and silver reserves plummeted to just 13.7%. Deep down, everyone knew that if people actually showed up and demanded their hard cash at the exact same time, the entire machine would instantly implode. And to patch over this massive liquidity crisis, states actually started passing laws allowing practically anyone to just open a bank. This birthed one of the most absurd systemic frauds in market history, the wildcat banks. You had these fraudulent operators setting up banks deep in the middle of nowhere, literally out in the woods, so note holders couldn't physically find them to demand their cash. When state inspectors showed up, neighboring banks would organize these crazy communication networks. They'd physically transport a single bag of gold coins by horse ahead of the inspector from bank to bank. And when they couldn't share coins, listen to this. They'd fill their vault barrels with heavy nails and broken glass, sprinkle a thin layer of real gold coins on top, and trick the regulators into certifying them. Then they'd just flood the local market with fake notes. Insane. So all it took was one rule to pop the entire balloon. Now, out west, speculators were using these highly depreciated, totally sketchy state banknotes to buy up millions of acres of public land. They'd buy the land, immediately mortgage it, borrow more fake paper currency, and buy more land. It's a classic, dangerous leverage loop. Jackson watches the federal treasury pile up with literal mountains of this toxic paper money, and he panics.
Bypassing Congress completely, he signs a blunt executive order in July 1836 called the Specie Circular. The new rule? From this day forward, you can only buy public land with actual physical gold or silver coin. Literally overnight, with one stroke of a pen, millions of acres of booming real estate turned into completely worthless paper. The portfolio impact of that single policy shift was violent and immediate. The land bubble didn't just slowly leak, it absolutely detonated. Buyers rushed their local state banks, demanding physical coin for their paper bills so they could keep doing real estate deals out west. Gold and silver were violently drained straight out of the major commercial hubs in the east. Look at New York's primary deposit banks. Their hard cash reserves plunged from over $7.2 million down to a critical $1.5 million by May 1837. Short-term business interest rates on the street literally doubled overnight, hitting a crushing 24%. The financial hubs were stripped completely bare. And just as domestic liquidity vanishes, the global spigot shuts completely off. As if a massive domestic cash squeeze wasn't bad enough, a brutal international shockwave hits at the exact same time. You've got this terrifying contradiction playing out. The US is frantically draining its own gold reserves to the western frontier. But simultaneously, across the Atlantic, the Bank of England realizes, wait, we are running dangerously low on gold bullion too. So what do? They aggressively jack up interest rates from 3 to 5 and then 6%, specifically to suck gold back to London. And crucially, they completely cut off credit to the major Anglo-American merchant houses. Transatlantic credit was paralyzed instantly. That move by the Bank of England instantly vaporized global demand for cotton, and cotton was the absolute lifeblood, the primary export engine of the U.S. economy. Production had just doubled to 600 million pounds, meaning there was already a massive supply glut. The exact second credit froze, cotton prices in New Orleans collapsed by 30%. Massive defaults ripped through the South. And Wall Street? Absolute total panic. Average daily trading volume on the exchange collapsed by nearly 80%, plummeting from over 7,300 shares a day to just 1,500. Margin calls went unmet. Billions of dollars in paper wealth just evaporated. By May 1837, we are looking at total systemic failure. And compounding the financial chaos, a brutal insect infestation wipes out American wheat crops, causing food prices to skyrocket exactly as cash is vanishing. Thousands of working-class families are facing literal starvation in the cities. Then, May 10, 1837 hits. Completely exhausted of all their gold and silver, New York City banks lock their doors. They officially suspend specie payments, flat out refusing to redeem their paper notes. Within days, every single bank in the nation follows suit. The market didn't just crash, it ceased to exist. The entire American payment system was paralyzed. But the wild twists don't stop there. Enter the attempt to corner the entire global cotton market. Any hope for a quick recovery was completely annihilated by what happens next. By the summer of 1838, the market stabilizes just a tiny bit, but Nicholas Biddle, the now disgraced former central banker, decides to make one last incredibly desperate, high-stakes gamble to rebuild his empire. Since he can't operate under a federal charter anymore, he rebrands his institution into a private commercial state bank. His new playbook? An aggressive, insanely leveraged play to literally corner the global cotton market. He uses his bank's capital, borrows heavily on short-term notes, and buys up massive quantities of the U.S. cotton crop. The strategy is to withhold all this cotton, starve British textile manufacturers of supply, and force them to pay massively inflated prices. And the gamble failed spectacularly. Cotton production out of India and America ended up far exceeding expectations, so the market gets hit with this massive global supply glut that completely crushes British prices. Biddle is left holding millions in totally illiquid, depreciating cotton bills. As international interest rates spike again, credit to American merchant houses gets choked off entirely. One New Orleans newspaper literally forewarned the incoming destruction, writing, "There will not be a house left to tell the tale." Biddle is forced to resign, he's later indicted for fraud, and his entire personal fortune and legacy are completely wiped off the map. It is the ultimate cost of toxic leverage. His bank suspends payments in October 1839, and that ignites a devastating second wave of bank failures. So what's the macro reality check here? The panic of 1837 was a sharp, brutal liquidity shock. But the collapse of Biddle's cotton corner in 1839, that locked the entire country into a structural nightmare. The United States plunged into a long, brutal era of debt deflation. From 1839 to 1843, domestic prices collapsed by a staggering 30%. President Jackson genuinely believed he was protecting the common retail guy by destroying the elitist central bank. But listen, macroeconomics simply doesn't care about populist rhetoric. By removing the only regulator capable of checking local bank inflation, he left everyday citizens completely defenseless against a catastrophic systemic collapse.
The sheer scale of wealth destruction triggered deep, lasting public disillusionment. People completely lost trust in paper credit and private finance altogether. It got so bad that the government was forced to pass the Independent Treasury Act of 1840, literally severing the tie between the government and the banking sector. Federal cash was locked up in secure physical vaults, totally isolated from private markets. On the regulatory side, the total disaster of those wildcat banks forced a massive rewrite of the rules. New York introduced a strict free banking model, demanding banks back up their notes with high-quality state bonds, which eventually became the structural foundation for the modern financial system we know today. The absolute destruction of the 1830s exposes a massive, ironic tragedy. When you tear down the institutional safety net to wage a political war, the free market always sends a brutal bill. So I want to pass this over to you. When political egos try to rewrite macroeconomic reality, who really pays the ultimate price? Drop down into the comments right now and let me know how you see this historical market failure comparing to the macro vulnerabilities we are tracking in our portfolios today. Let's debate it down below.
An investment in knowledge pays the best interest, so why not invest in this channel? Click like and subscribe for more.